A first-class seat, a paid ticket, a quiet black man minding his own business until a flight attendant tells him, "You don't belong here." What starts as a routine, boarding turns into a national reckoning when the man they try to humiliate turns out to be the CEO of a billion-dollar company and the biggest shareholder in the very airline that tried to remove him. What follows is a confrontation that doesn't end with anger but with corporate resignations, emergency board meetings, and a wave of reforms that shake an entire industry. This isn't just about a seat on a plane, it's about what happens when dignity refuses to be moved. You're going to want to stay until the end because, trust me, the moment he pulls out that final document, everything changes. Let us know where you're listening from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below. We read every one. It was 7:52 a.m. when Elliot Grant stepped through the automatic glass doors of Dallas-Fort Worth International, the wheels of his worn black carry-on whispering across the tile floor. Outside, the sky was a soft silver, caught between sunrise and storm, while inside the terminal hummed with the low drone of departure announcements and early morning conversations. He moved like a man with time unhurried, measured, wearing a light brown cardigan over a crisp white shirt, jeans pressed at the seams and scuffed loafers that had crossed more countries than most passports. In his left hand he held a small leather folder worn at the corners, the kind that said, "Old habits die hard," even for someone who ran a company that had just cracked the Fortune 100. Gate C12 was already filling up, though boarding hadn't yet begun. Business travelers clutched laptops and coffee couples in matching tracksuits leaned into each other with half-slept eyes, and the overhead board flickered quietly. Flight 2286 Dallas to New York on time. Elliot took a seat near the window where the plane waited with its belly open, swallowing luggage into the unseen. He checked his boarding pass again, seat 1B first class. It wasn't about the legroom or the champagne or the quiet. It was about peace. At his age, peace had become more valuable than perks. He slipped the pass back into his wallet, took a slow breath and closed his eyes. The sound of footsteps brought him back. A boarding announcement called pre-boarding for passengers needing assistance. Then the familiar rhythm, military premium first class. Elliot joined the short line and offered a polite nod to the gate agent. "Morning," he said quietly. She scanned his pass, hesitated for a blink, just long enough to register something, but then waved him through. As he entered the jet bridge, the cool air shifted around him, sterile, and still like the pause before a verdict. He stepped into the plane. The cabin was still empty, lights low, a soft instrumental playing from hidden speakers. Elliot made his way to 1B, stowed his briefcase neatly under the seat in front of him, and sat down. He didn't recline. He didn't pull out a tablet or a book. He simply folded his hands in his lap and watched the crew finish their preparations. A young man in two, glanced at him, and then away, uninterested. The silence inside the cabin was oddly comfortable, a kind of hush reserved for early flights and quiet thoughts. Elliot felt it settle in his chest like the first few sips of coffee, warm, grounded, certain. He had made it on time. That these days was half the battle. But the moment didn't last. The sudden clack of low heels on carpet broke the calm, followed by a clipped voice, polite, practiced, but unmistakably strained. "Excuse me, sir," the flight attendant said, her tablet already out, her eyebrows tight with suspicion. "This section is reserved for our premium passengers." Elliot looked up slowly with the patience of someone who had heard variations of this statement more times than he could count. He didn't frown or flinch. He simply said, "I believe I am one of them." He held up his boarding pass. She stared at it without taking it. "Seat 1B, he said gently. "First class." There was a beat, then another, the kind that makes strangers glance up from their newspapers. "Could I see your ID?" she asked, her voice still pleasant, but with an edge that carried. Elliot nodded, reached calmly into his inner jacket pocket, and handed her both his ID and the digital boarding pass. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything, just scanned the tablet again, tapped once, frowned. She muttered under her breath, as if speaking to the system more than to him. The first murmurs began 2 rows back. A man in 3C whispered to his wife. Someone in 4A began recording quietly behind a laptop screen. Elliot noticed all of it, the angle of the tablet in her hand, the subtle curl of her lip, the way her jaw flexed, as she tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed. And still he said nothing. That was his choice. To let the silence say what words never could. He had learned long ago that dignity doesn't always wear a suit and tie. Sometimes it wears a cardigan and carries a worn briefcase. Then she spoke again, this time louder. "Sir, it looks like your ticket is for coach. I'll need you to move to the back now so we can begin boarding." The word coach hung in the air like a slur, unintentional maybe, but sharp nonetheless. Elliot's throat tightened not from shock but from the old familiar weight of it all. He met her eyes, not defiantly, just honestly. "That's not correct," he said. "I purchased this seat 3 weeks ago. Fully refundable first class." He tapped the pass. 1B. The air shifted. It always did in moments like this. Like before a storm or a fire alarm when people stop pretending not to notice. He felt it on his skin, the awareness, the discomfort. The unspoken question hanging in the cabin like smoke, is he telling the truth? The woman's colleague walked over another uniform, another tight smile. "Problem here?" she asked, tilting her head as if they were discussing an order at a coffee shop. "Yes," the first one replied. "This gentleman appears to be confused about his assigned seat." Elliot sat still, hands folded again, waiting. He wasn't confused, he wasn't angry, but he was tired. Tired in the way only some people understand. Not from travel, but from being questioned in rooms he built, doubted in systems he funded, pushed aside in spaces he had earned his way into. Outside the window, the morning light had finally broken through the clouds. It cast a faint golden glow across the tarmac where luggage carts moved in practiced choreography. Inside the glow did not reach. Here in row 1B, the light had no permission yet. Elliot looked down at his watch. The second hand circled steadily, calm and indifferent. Time moved forward whether people wanted it to or not. And in that moment, Elliot Grant, CEO, father, son of a teacher and a welder, knew that once again he would have to prove what should have been unquestioned. He let out a slow breath, leaned back into his seat, just enough to remind himself he still belonged in it, and said, not bitterly, not defiantly, but with the quiet force of a man who's fought too many battles to waste words, "Now you're making a mistake." And the plane kept boarding, and the cabin grew smaller, and somewhere in the distance a reckoning began to stir. The murmur of voices in the first-class cabin was beginning to shift, like the low creaking of a ship just before it lists. People weren't speaking loudly yet, just enough to be heard by the person next to them, but not enough to be held responsible. Elliot could feel it in the air, the way tension gathers invisibly like humidity before a storm. The flight attendant Cheryl was now joined by another crew member, taller, younger, sharper in posture, who offered no introduction, only a quick look at Elliot followed by a comment barely concealed beneath a smile. "We've had some guests accidentally sit in the wrong cabin before, sir. Would you mind double-checking your ticket one more time?" Elliot didn't sigh. He didn't scoff or scoot forward in annoyance. He just reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan, pulled out his wallet with measured movement, and handed her the pass again along with his ID. "It hasn't changed in the last 2 minutes," he said calmly, "but you're welcome to verify." She took the documents with fingers just a bit too fast, eyes darting across the screen of her tablet, tapping, as if input alone could alter the result. Around him, the performance was becoming public. The man across the aisle leaned slightly toward the window, pretending not to notice, but his reflection in the glass betrayed his interest. A woman 2 rows back began whispering into her phone, shielding her mouth like a child watching something she shouldn't. A businessman in 1C shifted his laptop screen downward and glanced sideways, not yet choosing a side, but very much awake now to the scent of scandal. The younger attendant cleared her throat. "Sir, our system shows your ticket as economy," she said, her voice louder than necessary as if projecting toward an unseen jury. "We're happy to reseat you in the main cabin so we can proceed with boarding." Elliot stared at her for a long second, not unkindly, not even challengingly, but with that gaze people only learn to hold after being dismissed more times than they care to count. He spoke slowly, evenly. "I booked this ticket myself directly 3 weeks ago, paid in full. It's not a courtesy upgrade. It's not a points redemption. It's a purchase." The woman blinked, then turned back to Cheryl, who stood with arms crossed and jaw set like a teacher waiting for a child to admit a lie. "Anyone can make a mistake, sir," Cheryl chimed in, her tone syrupy and firm. "Sometimes when people aren't familiar with the booking system, they think they've selected a certain class, but I'm quite familiar," Elliot interrupted, not with anger but with exhaustion. He reached down, unzipped his briefcase, and retrieved a metal card, the kind with no expiration date, no raised numbers, just clean engraving and weight. "This is my Skyfast Elite card," he said, placing it gently on the tray table, like a playing card in a high-stakes game. 500,000 miles flown, platinum for 7 consecutive years. Silence followed, not from the attendants, but from the cabin. The murmuring paused, heads shifted. The businessman in 1C gave a second glance longer this time, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion but recalculation. One row behind a college-aged woman who had just put away her earbuds, reopened her phone, and with one finger started filming. But Cheryl barely glanced at the card. "Sir," she said, her voice tightening, "these cards are available through promotions all the time. People buy them online. They don't prove anything." She gestured vaguely toward the back of the plane. "I'm going to have to ask you to move, or we'll need to contact airport security." Elliot felt a flicker of heat rise in his chest, not the burning kind that comes with rage, but the subtle warmth of a boundary being crossed one too many times. He looked past the two women toward the cockpit and saw movement. A figure stepped out, Captain Ray Dobson, tall, gray-haired posture, stiff and deliberate, like a man still fighting the war he trained for 30 years ago. He surveyed the scene, then approached. "What's the issue here?" he asked, directing the question at Cheryl without so much as glancing at Elliot. Cheryl turned slightly, voice dipping into something between authority and complaint. "This gentleman is sitting in first class, but refuses to move to his assigned seat in coach." The word "refuses" struck the cabin like a tuning fork, vibrating just beneath the surface. Elliot sat upright. "Captain," he said, his voice unwavering, "my name is Elliot Grant. I have a boarding pass for seat 1B, which I purchased weeks ago. I've shown it. I've shown my ID. I've shown my status." He offered the documents again, hand outstretched, but Dobson didn't reach for them. Instead, the captain narrowed his eyes, took in Elliot's outfit, the cardigan, the jeans, the loafers, and gave a small shake of his head. "Sir," he said, "I've been flying for 25 years. I've seen every trick in the book. If you're trying to get a free upgrade, this isn't the way to do it." A sharp breath came from the row behind. Someone whispered Jesus under their breath. Elliot remained still. "You didn't even look at my documents," he said quietly. "You made your judgment based on everything but evidence." Dobson bristled. "Ma'am," he said to Cheryl, "call ground security. We'll have him removed if he won't cooperate." The words weren't shouted, but they cut through the cabin like broken glass. Elliot slowly reached into his blazer, pulled out his phone, and opened the camera app. For the record, he began, his tone controlled but weighty. "This is Elliot Grant at Gate C-12 Skyfast Flight 2286 to New York Seat 1B. I'm being threatened with removal despite valid documentation and a fully paid first-class ticket." Sir Dobson barked, "Put that phone away." "I'm documenting discrimination," Elliot said simply. The phone stayed up steady, catching the rigid stance of the flight crew, the slowly forming ring of recording passengers, the tightening silence that now filled every row like fog. A man in two, a leaned-forward, older white Southern drawl, clinging to his words. "Son," he said, "maybe just move to your actual seat and save everyone the trouble." Elliot turned toward him, eyes calm, voice low. "This is my actual seat." And for a moment, that was it. That line, that refusal to shrink, that willingness to hold a space that others had tried to erase. The man in 2A exhaled, shook his head, and leaned back, suddenly very interested in the safety card in the seat pocket. All around them, the tension held, pressurized, unspoken, recorded. The cabin didn't boil. It simply simmered. Heat below the surface. Truth just beneath the skin. And as Cheryl spoke into her radio requesting assistance at the gate, Elliot simply sat there, still poised, eyes forward, like a man who'd been here before, who'd walked into rooms where he wasn't welcome and stayed anyway. Because sometimes the loudest protest isn't shouting, it's staying seated when the world insists you stand down. It started with a buzz, soft, metallic, the kind that barely registers until it becomes a rhythm in your bones. Elliot's phone vibrated once in the inside pocket of his cardigan, and without moving too much, he glanced at the screen. The message was short, running behind. "Begin without me." He locked the phone, slipped it back into his pocket, and sat quietly, his spine still straight despite the growing pressure around him. The first-class cabin had become unnaturally quiet, like the space just before a thunderclap, where everyone feels the tension, but no one admits it aloud. There was a low chorus of murmurs now, passengers pretending to read, to scroll to sleep, while all the while their eyes flicked sideways, their phones angled slightly, ready to capture the moment something exploded. The cabin lights, cool and soft, only minutes ago seemed suddenly harsh, flattening every crease and shadow on his face, exposing each micro-expression like a confession. Elliot could feel it, how quickly neutrality fades when a black man holds his ground. He shifted his gaze to the front where Cheryl stood again by the bulkhead, whispering into her shoulder radio, requesting ground presence at gate C12. Passenger refuses to comply. Potential disruption. The words weren't shouted, but they were clear, measured, calculated. He wondered how many times that phrase, potential disruption, had been used to describe someone like him. Not for raising his voice, not for moving, but simply for not moving away. The murmurs from the rear rows were growing louder now, no longer confined to private corners. "What's going on up there?" a man asked. "Some guy won't move from first class," another replied. "Says it's his seat, but they think he's bluffing." That word bluffing landed like a pebble in a pond, sending ripples through the silence. Elliot didn't react. He couldn't afford to. Every twitch, every breath too loud, every word delivered with a decibel, more than necessary, would be interpreted, spun, weaponized. That was the exhausting part. Not the confrontation, but the containment. He reached into his briefcase again, this time not for documentation, but for posture, for something to do with his hands so he wouldn't clench them. As he adjusted the strap on the side pouch, he noticed the reflection of a woman in 3C recording everything on her phone, eyes wide behind thin-rimmed glasses. She wasn't pretending not to look. She wasn't hiding her interest behind a paperback or a tablet. She was documenting now, and she was angry. Not at him, but at what was unfolding. "Excuse me," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmurs directed toward Cheryl and the second attendant. "I saw him show you his boarding pass. Why aren't you just checking it properly?" Cheryl turned slightly, her lips pressed tight. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but we've got it under control." The woman stood halfway still, holding her phone. "You're asking a man to leave a seat he paid for, and you haven't even verified the system properly. How is that under control?" The tension cracked for a moment, just long enough for others to take sides, some vocal, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to support or disappear into the upholstery. Elliot remained still, not silent out of fear but out of strategy. The less he gave them, the more their actions stood naked on their own. And sure enough, the flight crew's response was to escalate. Cheryl stepped forward, eyes no longer polite. "Sir," she said, "security is on its way. You'll need to leave the aircraft voluntarily or be escorted." He nodded once, then picked up his phone again. This time he hit record. "Time is 8:06 a.m., he said evenly. "Gate C12 Skyfast Airways. I'm Elliot Grant. I have been asked to leave a seat I paid for without due cause." The captain returned, flanked now by two security officers, one tall and pale, the other shorter Asian, their badges discreet but visible, the radio clips on their shoulders squawking low. "What's the situation?" asked the taller man, scanning the faces quickly. Already aware this would not be simple, Cheryl gestured at Elliot without using his name. "This passenger is refusing to comply. He's sitting in a seat he didn't pay for." The shorter officer badge reading L. Chen stepped forward and addressed Elliot with quiet authority. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Elliot handed it over, still seated, voice calm. "Of course. And my ID if you need it." Chen took the documents, examined them carefully, checking the details with the tablet on his belt, frowning slightly as the screen lit up. He turned to Cheryl. "According to this, he's booked in seat 1B, first class. Fully paid." A flicker of discomfort crossed Cheryl's face, but she held the line. "Our system doesn't show it that way." Chen didn't argue. He simply stated, "This barcode matches the reservation on our manifest. It came from your system." The other officer, Santos, looked at Elliot with something approaching curiosity. "Sir, would you mind stepping off the plane for a moment, just to verify everything with the gate agent directly?" Elliot considered it not because he had to, but because the request was delivered with respect. He stood, gathered his belongings, and nodded. As he stepped into the aisle, the woman in 3C caught his eye again. "They're going to find out," she whispered. "Everyone's watching." He gave her a small nod, not of gratitude but of understanding. Outside the cabin, the gate area had changed. A crowd had gathered, drawn by delay announcements and whispers. Phones were raised now, some live streaming, others snapping pictures, every face locked in a shared expression of disbelief. The energy in the terminal was different from that on the plane, more volatile, more connected, more awake. People weren't just watching a disagreement, they were watching a system reveal itself in real time. A man in a business suit muttered, "What year is it? How is this still happening?" A teenager nearby answered, "It's always happening, you just haven't seen it until now." The gate agent, red-faced and flustered, was already on the phone as Elliot approached, documents in hand. Behind him, Santos followed, expression unreadable. "Ma'am," Santos said, "can you verify this gentleman's seat?" The agent hesitated. "It's complicated. Our records show a mismatch." Santos raised an eyebrow. "You mean your records or your assumptions?" There was a pause, brief, cold, unmistakable. Elliot didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room was speaking for him now, filling the silence with judgment, with questions, with something that sounded dangerously like accountability. His phone vibrated again. Another message. "Boardroom session moved up. We'll call you in 5. He looked at the screen, then around the gate, then down at the boarding pass in his hand. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself a breath of weariness, the kind that starts in the chest and spreads to the eyes. Not because he was tired of defending himself, but because he knew this wasn't the last time he'd have to. He adjusted the strap of his briefcase, his shoulders square, and turned toward the window. Outside, the plane still waited, gleaming under the rising sun, beautiful, expensive, and oblivious. And as he stood there, surrounded by voices, by judgment, by digital witnesses who had only just begun to understand what was unfolding, Elliot Grant felt something shift, not just in the air or the crowd, but in the center of his own body. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was certainty. The certainty that whatever came next, he would not flinch. Not this time, not ever again. The moment the gate supervisor appeared, Elliot knew the situation was entering its next stage, not because of her title, but because of the way she walked. Janet Doyle didn't rush, didn't fumble, didn't apologize with her steps. She walked like a person who had put out enough small fires to know which ones could wait and which ones could not. Her uniform was pressed to crisp lines, her badge pinned slightly off-center, and her face carried that expression of forced calm that comes not from peace, but from control. As she approached Santos, the taller of the two security officers handed her Elliot's documents without saying much. She took them silently, her fingers grazing the edge of the boarding pass as if it might bite. "Mr. Grant," she began, "your documents seem in order. However, there are still concerns about your behavior toward the flight crew." Elliot said nothing at first. He simply met her eyes, not defiantly, not pleadingly, just with the tired composure of a man who had heard that word behavior weaponized too many times. "Behavior," he repeated, his voice, level not raised, but sharp enough to hold a line. "You mean sitting in my assigned seat and answering questions I've already answered?" Janet didn't flinch, but there was the slightest shift in her posture, like a chess player, realizing the game might be more complicated than expected. "The crew has filed a disruption report," she said, placing the boarding pass back into Elliot's hand. "We can reseat you in coach, or you can take the next flight." The crowd behind them had grown larger, pressing closer to the gate, and the hum of whispers was now layered with the digital chime of notifications and live streams. Somewhere behind Elliot, the woman from seat 3C, Dr. Patricia Voss, he would later learn, raised her voice again. "I was sitting right there," she said. This man didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He showed his documents. "Why exactly is he being removed?" Janet glanced toward her, the look of someone used to being challenged but not accustomed to losing. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said sharply. "This is between our staff and Mr. Grant." But Dr. Voss didn't move. "And I'm a paying customer," she replied. "And what I witnessed was discrimination. If you're going to remove someone, you better be ready to explain it to all of us." A man in a tailored suit who had been quietly watching from a corner of the gate area stepped forward now. "She's right," he said. "The flight attendant didn't even check his ID at first. Just assumed he didn't belong." He turned to Elliot. "You didn't do anything wrong. Not from what I saw." Janet's face was still, but her knuckles had gone white around the edge of her tablet. It wasn't just a mistake now. It was a situation. And worse, it was being recorded from multiple angles. Elliot could feel the shift, not in the tone of voices, but in the silence between them. He knew that silence. It came before someone backed down or someone doubled down. He looked at Janet and spoke quietly. "I'd like to escalate this to your district manager." She exhaled through her nose. "Sir, I'm the senior supervisor on duty. I have full authority here." Elliot nodded once. Then I respectfully request that you contact someone above you. I'll wait." Phones were everywhere now, some held at chest height, others more brazen, aimed directly at the group like a firing squad of truth. The gate's departure board behind them flickered again. Flight 2286 to New York. Delayed 14 minutes. The crowd had grown thick, and somewhere nearby, someone muttered, "This is gonna go viral." Janet tapped her earpiece, but before she could speak, Elliot's phone vibrated again. He checked the message and smiled faintly, more with irony than satisfaction. Board meeting moved to conference room A. Emergency session. Begin when ready. He locked the screen and looked up, his eyes meeting Janet's. "You're about to get a call," he said calmly. "It'll come from your executive office. I suggest you take it." Janet narrowed her eyes. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Elliot reached into his briefcase, unzipped the inner flap, and removed a simple black card holder. He pulled out one card and handed it to her with both hands, not performative but deliberate. She glanced down at the card, then back at him, then down again. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. The crowd behind them began shifting forward as though pulled by gravity, and someone whispered, "Wait, what does it say, Doctor?" Voss leaned in and read the card over Janet's shoulder. Then she whispered it out loud. "Elliot Grant, Chief Executive Officer, Grant Tech Solutions." Janet's eyes flicked back up, searching his face for some sign that it was fake, that it was exaggerated, that this wasn't what it looked like. But Elliot didn't blink. The man in the tailored suit had already begun typing on his phone. "Holy," he muttered, "Grant Tech is worth over $2 billion. A voice from the back of the crowd, younger, high-pitched, chimed in. "He's not just a CEO, he's that CEO." The live streams now showed a name, not just a face, not just a seat dispute, a name with weight. And for the first time, the silence belonged to Janet. Her radio crackled. "Supervisor Doyle, please report to Main Operations Priority 1. Elliot checked his watch. "Right on time," he said softly. Then he turned, scanning the crowd slowly, not to grandstand, not to bask, but to make eye contact with the people who were still watching him, like a story unfolding in real time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice just enough to be heard without shouting, "I apologize for the delay. I know many of you are just trying to get to where you're going. So am I." And in that moment, he wasn't just the center of a scandal. He was a mirror. A reflection of everything this country still struggled to confront. Not because of what he said, but because of how calmly, how patiently he had forced the system to reveal itself. Janet's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and froze. It was the number for Patricia Glenn, the CEO of Skyfast Airways. She didn't answer right away. She was still holding Elliot's card, still staring at his face, still deciding if what was happening could somehow be walked back. But there was no walking back from this. Elliot remained still, briefcase in one hand, the weight of 100 cameras catching every breath, every flicker of thought across his face. He had said little. He had done even less. And yet the story had written itself around him, not because he wanted it, but because it was long overdue. The first thing Elliot noticed was the ripple not in the crowd but on the screen of a teenager's phone nearby. A red bubble, a flashing alert, and then the voice, "Yo, it's trending. Look, Skyfast discrimination." That word, digital and weightless, began its quiet flight into chaos, gliding from one device to another like pollen in a windstorm. Within minutes, the live stream had climbed past 1-800 viewers, and strangers from other terminals were walking toward Gate C-12, pulled not by boarding calls, but by the magnetic pull of something real unfolding. People were no longer just watching a passenger being questioned. They were witnessing a system malfunction in plain sight. Elliot stood off to the side, just beyond the velvet rope barrier that separated ticketed passengers from the terminal crowd. His briefcase rested beside him untouched, since he had been asked to step off the plane. A gate agent typed frantically at her podium, her fingers too fast, too tense, the way people type when they're trying to fix something they know is already broken. Behind her, the departure board blinked again. Flight 2286, delayed 23 minutes. That number, Elliot knew, would continue to grow, because once a story leaves the runway of privacy, there's no containing the turbulence. A voice from the crowd called out, "What's his name?" And another answered, "Elliot Grant, CEO of Grant Tech." The name carried farther than expected. An older woman whispered, "Wait, I've heard of that company." And a young man near the back added, "They do cybersecurity government contracts, serious stuff." It was no longer a scene, it was now a narrative. and Elliot, whether he'd planned to be or not, had become its reluctant center. Janet returned with 2 senior staff members in tow, one holding a clipboard, the other scanning the growing crowd with a look of reluctant dread. "We need to move this away from the gate," she whispered to Santos, who nodded slowly but didn't act. Instead, he turned to Elliot. "Sir, would you be comfortable stepping into the glass conference room down the hall?" Elliot glanced toward the space modern cold, mostly empty, and then toward the dozens of recording phones that filled the terminal. "No," he said calmly. "I'd prefer to stay where the witnesses are." It wasn't a challenge, it was protection. Because Elliot had learned long ago that injustice shrinks in the presence of light, but grows bold in the dark. He reached down into his briefcase and pulled out a black leather folder, thick, clean, unadorned. Opening it, he revealed several documents, each in plastic sleeves, each with careful notations in the margins. He placed them on an empty chair next to him, then held one up. "This," he said, voice even steady, "is the annual travel expenditure report for Grant Tech Solutions. Last fiscal year, $1.3 million in flight bookings with SkyFast Airways. That's 487 flights. That's nearly 2,000 employees traveling coast to coast." The businessman from earlier, still in his blazer, still with the LinkedIn app open, stepped forward. "You're saying your company gives them over $1 million a year," Elliot nodded without ceremony. "And yet I was treated like a stowaway." He held up another sheet. "Here's my personal flight log platinum status for 7 consecutive years. 540,000 miles logged. Last year alone, 61 flights. That's more than some crew members." There were murmurs now, not just of surprise, but of realization how quickly the appearance of someone could be mistaken for irrelevance, how deeply assumptions ran beneath uniforms and titles. A woman near the security lane whispered, "This is going to be everywhere by tonight," and her friend replied, "It already is." Elliot reached for the final document and paused. It felt heavier than the others, not because of its content, but because of its irony. "Last year," he said slowly, "the SkyFast Foundation received an anonymous donation, $500,000, to fund their new Diversity in Aviation initiative, training awareness outreach. Do you know where that money came from?" No one answered, but he didn't wait. He held it up. "From the Grant Foundation, my foundation." The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was shame. Palpable, dense, settling over the gate like a fog no one could walk through without feeling smaller. Cheryl, now standing off to the side, shifted her weight and looked down at the carpet. Captain Dobson, halfway down the hall, had stopped walking and turned back slightly, his eyes darting between Elliot and the conference room like someone realizing he was about to be called to the front of the class without his homework. A boy, no older than 17, whispered to his mother, "So they took his money to fix this exact problem and still did it to him." And the mother, eyes wide, simply said, "Yeah, baby, they did." Elliot closed the folder, returned it to his briefcase, and sat slowly on the chair next to the documents. His posture was the same as it had been on the plane, straight, composed, entirely unshaken. But inside he could feel it something ancient and bone-deep. The ache of having to justify your presence again and again, even when the evidence is stacked in your favor. A voice from behind the gate agent's counter broke through the stillness. "Mr. Grant, the airline CEO would like to speak with you directly. She's on the line now." Elliot looked toward the phone, then toward Janet, then back to the crowd. "Put it on speaker," he said. "They deserve to hear it too." The agent hesitated, glanced toward Janet, who nodded once with visible reluctance, and then pressed the speaker button. The voice that emerged was firm, controlled, clipped with corporate polish. "Mr. Grant, this is Patricia Glenn, CEO of SkyFast Airways. I've just left an emergency board meeting. Please tell me what happened at Gate C-12. Elliot didn't raise his voice, didn't embellish, didn't reach for sympathy. He simply spoke the facts, the boarding pass, the ID, the refusal, the assumptions, the dismissal. And as he spoke, the crowd didn't move. No one checked their watch. No one left for coffee. Even the airport announcer in the background seemed to pause between flight calls. When he finished, he added only this: "This isn't about me. This is about every person who doesn't get to speak in front of a crowd when they're pushed out of a seat they paid for." Patricia's silence on the other end was long. Then, "Mr. Grant, I'm authorizing immediate corrective action. Whatever you recommend, I'll sign off. We cannot afford this, not morally, not legally, not financially." Elliot looked around once more. The cameras were still rolling, the faces still watching, the message still spreading. And for the first time that day, he allowed himself a slow, deliberate exhale, not of relief but of control returned. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar into the room. Sometimes it takes a seat and stays there until the room changes around it. The call came through on the gate agent's monitor as a high-priority transmission, flashing red and vibrating against the metal counter like something alive. Janet hesitated, fingers resting just above the accept button, her knuckles pale against the smooth black plastic. Across from her, Elliot stood with his hands clasped lightly behind his back, his expression unreadable but unshakably calm, as though he had been waiting for this moment long before the flight was even announced. Passengers clustered around the gate area watched, without blinking, the quiet hum of phones recording and the dull click of camera shutters replacing the usual pre-boarding chatter. When she finally tapped the screen, the speakerphone crackled once. Then a voice came through, clear, steady, unmistakably in charge. "Janet, is Mr. Grant with you, Patricia?" Glenn's voice was composed, but anyone listening closely could hear the strain beneath the polish. Janet glanced at Elliot, nodded stiffly, and answered, "Yes, ma'am." "He's right here." "Put him on," Patricia said, and for a moment the silence deepened, stretching like fabric pulled taut before it tears. Elliot stepped forward, placing one hand gently on the counter, as if to anchor the conversation to something solid. "Good morning, Patricia," he said, voice smooth but firm. "I'm at gate C12, and I believe your team already knows why." There was a pause, not long but long enough for everyone to feel it. Then Patricia replied, "Tell me exactly what happened." He didn't raise his voice, didn't dramatize the moment. Instead, he recited the sequence of events with clinical precision. The boarding pass presented the ID, ignored the accusations, made the refusal to check systems, the call to security. As he spoke, heads in the crowd turned toward each other with growing disbelief, and the weight of what was being said began to take shape, not as an incident, but as a pattern. When he finished, there was another pause, and then Patricia asked, "Is any of this being documented?" Elliot didn't even glance around. "Multiple passengers have been live streaming for the past 30 minutes, he said. "One video has already passed 30,000 views. Skyfast is trending for the wrong reasons." Patricia exhaled through the line, a soft hiss of corporate dread. "I just left an emergency board meeting," she said. "We're reviewing this in real time. The stock's down 2.1% in the last hour. Legal's on standby. This is serious." Elliot nodded once, even though she couldn't see him. "Yes," he replied. "It is." She didn't waste time on excuses. "What do you need, Elliot?" she asked, her voice tighter now, her formality stripped to something more direct, almost human. "I need your crew to understand the magnitude of what they've done," he said. "Not just to me, but to your brand, to your reputation, and to every passenger who's ever wondered if they belong." From a few feet behind, Dr. Voss stepped closer, arms crossed, expression firm. "He's not exaggerating," she called out toward the phone. "We all saw it. They treated him like he was lying just because of how he looked." Patricia's voice faltered for a breath. "Who's speaking, doctor?" "Patricia Voss," she replied. "Physician, passenger, and witness, and I'll testify to everything." Elliot didn't turn around, but he felt the support like a quiet wind at his back. "I'm authorizing full corrective action," Patricia said, her words now. "Quicker, more urgent. You'll have my full support, Elliot. Whatever you suggest, I'll sign off." Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, not from weariness, but from choice, from the deliberate pause of someone who understands the weight of what they are about to say. "Then let's begin with truth," he said. He opened the folder he had been carrying all morning and laid it gently on the counter pages, fanned out like evidence submitted to a court. "First," he said, holding up a printed summary, "immediate termination of the flight crew involved in the incident, not as punishment but as accountability." Around the terminal, a murmur rippled through the crowd, some gasping softly, others nodding with solemn approval. Second, he continued mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff within 30 days. Not an online module, a real course with real instructors and measurable outcomes. Patricia didn't hesitate. "Done," she said. "That's already in motion." Third, Elliot said, lifting another document, a third-party anonymous reporting system for passengers and employees to report discrimination or harassment without fear of retaliation. "We'll implement it within the week," Patricia replied. Fourth, Elliot added, voice steady, "a public apology. Not hidden in fine print, not buried in a press release. A clear statement from your executive team acknowledging the pattern, not just the event." This time, Patricia paused. "Elliot," she said, "a public apology could expose us to legal liability." His gaze didn't move. "Your legal liability is already significant," he said. And right now there are 4,000 people watching this live. The only thing worse than being wrong is pretending you weren't." Patricia sighed quietly, then said, "All right." Full statement reviewed by legal, published across all platforms. "We'll take the hit honestly." Elliot nodded once, then reached for the last document, this one heavier, printed on thicker paper, signed and sealed in triplicate. "And fifth," he said, holding it aloft, "a new standard executive compensation tied to performance in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Starting with you." The crowd fell into an even deeper silence, one that felt sacred, like the final moment before a verdict is read. Patricia didn't respond immediately, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than before. "You want my bonus tied to DEI performance metrics?" Elliot's answer was simple: yes. Because leadership is not about weathering storms, it's about preventing them. There was no applause, no cheering, no fanfare, just stillness. Then Patricia's voice, quieter than ever, agreed. "You'll have everything you need." And then, after a pause, she added, "Thank you for not letting this go." Elliot closed the folder, clipped the papers back into place, and returned them to his briefcase with slow, deliberate care. Around him, people began to exhale. Some wiped their eyes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others simply stared at him, not with awe, but with something deeper: recognition. Not of his name or title or wealth, but of the quiet strength it takes to stand, to wait, and to speak plainly when the world expects silence. As the call ended and the terminal slowly resumed its natural hum, Elliot remained exactly where he was, not out of stubbornness, but because he knew what that space had become. Not a gate, not a spectacle, but a line drawn in public between who we claim to be and who we actually are. And as the sun began to rise through the tall windows behind him, casting long shadows across the waiting area, Elliot Grant stood still, bathed not in spotlight, but in something far more enduring: clarity. The boardroom inside Skyfast's corporate headquarters was colder than expected, not from the air conditioning, but from the quiet tension that settled in before the call began. 12 executives sat around a sleek mahogany table, their eyes fixed on the large screen at the end of the room where Elliot Grant's image had just come into frame. He wasn't in a private office or a polished media room. He was still at Gate C-12, standing calmly with his hands resting on a chair, surrounded by passengers, airport staff, and the quiet chaos his presence had unmasked. Behind him, the murmurs of a waiting crowd faded into background noise, replaced by the low hum of an institution bracing for impact. Patricia Glenn, CEO of Skyfast Airways, sat at the head of the boardroom table with her hands folded tightly, the edges of her knuckles white. "Elliot," she began, her voice more composed than it had been earlier, "the full board is present. Legal is listening. You have the floor." The camera angle captured everything: the exhausted patience in Elliot's posture, the quiet authority in his voice, the way his eyes met the screen. Not with hostility, but with something far more difficult to face: expectation. "Thank you, Patricia," he said, adjusting the tablet in his hand slightly. "Before we discuss solutions, I'd like to establish the full context of what occurred today." He turned slightly and gestured toward the woman standing beside him. "This is Sarah Mitchell, the flight attendant who first approached me." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped in front of her, her face tight with unease. "Miss Mitchell," Elliot said, not unkindly, "would you mind telling the board what you said to me when I first sat down?" Sarah hesitated, then glanced at the screen, her voice barely audible. "I told him that section was for premium passengers only." Patricia leaned forward, her brows drawing together. Despite him holding a first-class ticket, Sarah nodded. "Yes, I didn't ask to see it. I assumed it was a mistake." A pause followed, not long but dense. No one spoke. And when I presented my frequent flyer card, Elliot asked, his voice even. "I said anyone could get those cards online," Sarah replied, shrinking into herself. Elliot didn't press her further. He simply looked back toward the camera and said, "Assumptions are not mistakes. They are decisions made quickly, often unconsciously, and they shape outcomes long before evidence enters the room." David Kim, one of the board members, leaned in. "Miss Mitchell," he asked, "what made you assume Mr. Grant's documentation was invalid?" The question landed heavily. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, then looked away. Elliot intervened before she had to answer. "I'll spare her the discomfort. She assumed what many people have assumed for decades, that a black man in casual clothes doesn't belong in first class." The silence was no longer awkward. It was instructional. Patricia exhaled slowly, and then asked the question everyone knew was coming. Elliot, what would appropriate resolution look like from your perspective? He took a moment before answering, glancing around the waiting area behind him where passengers still stood, watching phones, still recording the flight, still delayed, but no longer the story. First, he said, immediate termination of all personnel directly involved in the discriminatory actions, not to punish but to protect your standard. If bias goes unchecked, it becomes protocol. On screen, some executives shifted uncomfortably, and Patricia scribbled something in her notebook. Second, Elliot continued mandatory comprehensive bias and empathy training for all customer-facing employees within 30 days. Not a box-ticking exercise, but one rooted in stories, experiences, and reflection. Agreed, Patricia said quietly. Third, he added, holding up another document, creation of an anonymous third-party reporting system for all bias-related incidents. One that passengers and employees alike can access without fear. Another board member, Sarah Rodriguez, nodded. That's doable. Fourth, Elliot said, establishment of a $500 fund dedicated to improving diversity and inclusion efforts within your organization. That's not just a number, it's a commitment. Patricia didn't respond immediately, but the look on her face said she understood what that kind of money represented. Not damage control, but forward investment. And fifth, Elliot concluded a formal public apology, acknowledging systemic failures and your commitment to reform. Not to me, to your customers. There was a pause as everyone took that in the weight of it, not in the dollar figures, but in the shift it required. Public vulnerability from a company built on polish and control. Elliot, Patricia said, slowly, a public apology will open us to liability. Elliot didn't raise his voice. You're already liable, he said. The question is whether you want to control the narrative or have it controlled for you. Patricia looked at her legal team, who whispered back and forth quickly. After a moment, she nodded. All conditions accepted. The screen flickered slightly, and the reaction from the crowd at Gate C12 was immediate. There wasn't applause, not yet. Just a collective breath held too long, finally released. But Elliot wasn't done. There's one final element, he said. I want real-time implementation, not vague future promises, not empty PR. I want changes within 72 hours. A murmur ran through the boardroom. Michael Torres, the VP of Operations, frowned. 72 hours, that's impossible. We have union constraints, vendor contracts, system. Elliot cut in calmly. Michael, your airline rerouted hundreds of flights in under 6 hours last winter due to a snowstorm. When pressed, your systems are capable of remarkable speed. What's lacking is often not infrastructure but will. Patricia sat back in her chair watching Elliot carefully, as if seeing him fully for the first time. What specifically do you want within that timeline, she asked. Elliot answered without hesitation. Sarah Mitchell and Captain Dobson terminated within 24 hours. Updated crew training materials deployed within 48. Anonymous reporting system online within 72. If these benchmarks are not met, Grant Tech will divest fully from Skyfast and recommend that our partner companies, 47 of them, do the same. It was a seismic statement delivered in an even voice, the kind of declaration that doesn't need emphasis to carry weight, the kind that changes boardroom agendas and stock forecasts in real time. Jennifer Walsh, another board member, asked, and how will we know these measures are working? Elliot looked into the camera and said, you'll bring in external auditors. You'll publish quarterly progress reports. You'll earn back the trust you just broke. Patricia nodded slowly. All of it approved, she said, and we'll begin immediately. Elliot nodded once, then closed the folder on the table in front of him. Then we have a framework, he said. Now let's make sure this framework becomes reality. And with that, the video call ended, and Elliot turned toward the waiting passengers still standing behind him. Many of them were strangers, but they weren't strangers anymore, not after what they'd witnessed. And in their eyes, he didn't see awe or pity. He saw belief. Not in him, but in the idea that someone somewhere had finally drawn a line and refused to step back. It didn't take long for the consequences to begin arriving, first as whispers, then as headlines, then as hard action pressed into motion. Within 48 hours of the boardroom decision, Skyfast's public relations department issued a carefully worded but unmistakably sincere apology, one that didn't hide behind vague terms like misunderstanding or incident, but named the real issue: racial bias, systemic failure, and a culture in need of reform. The statement was published across every channel the airline-owned: website, banners, boarding confirmation, emails, gate displays, and even in-flight announcements. Passengers logging into their SkyFast accounts were met with a short video of Patricia Glenn standing alone in the company's central atrium, admitting the truth. "We failed. Not once, but repeatedly. And we're changing that starting now." Outside corporate walls, the world was already watching with the kind of attention that couldn't be bought or redirected. News outlets picked up the story faster than the airline's PR team could frame it, but the damage wasn't just reputational, it was emotional. People weren't just angry at the airline, they were angry because the story felt personal. For many, Elliot Grant wasn't just a CEO, he was a symbol of every seat they'd been told wasn't theirs, every voice they'd lowered to avoid confrontation, every moment they'd swallowed injustice just to get home on time. In the terminal where it had all started, the ripple effect was visible in the smallest of details. Flight attendants now greeted passengers with an attentiveness that wasn't performative but reflective, as if each exchange carried the weight of the company's apology. Supervisors walked the concourses more often, listening, instead of instructing, observing, instead of commanding. Employees who had never spoken about workplace bias were beginning to ask questions quietly, at first, then more confidently, as the company's internal reporting system launched and, to everyone's surprise, actually worked. Within the first 24 hours, the anonymous portal logged nearly 200 submissions. Not all were formal complaints. Many were stories, small observations, fragments of conversation that suggested something deeper than isolated events. A gate agent mocked a customer's accent. A supervisor joked about a black family holding up boarding. "I've seen how people get assigned middle seats when they speak Spanish." The stories were both familiar and haunting, the kind that sat in the stomach long after being read. In Elliot's own office in Chicago, those reports began to arrive as data, not just numbers on a screen, but evidence of a system slowly turning inward to face itself. His assistant Maria brought in a fresh stack of documents every morning, neatly organized and color-coded, but Elliot often read them in silence, not rushing through them like tasks, but absorbing them like lessons. These were not complaints, they were testimonies, and he treated them as such. Maria entered quietly one morning and said, "CNN's asking for a follow-up interview. They want you to talk about the changes." Elliot didn't look up from the report in his hands. "Let's wait," he replied. "Not yet. Let the work speak first." He had no desire to turn what happened into a media victory. Visibility had never been the goal. Accountability had. Still, the effects of what had happened were impossible to ignore. SkyFast's stock, which had dipped during the initial firestorm, rebounded more quickly than analysts expected. Investors responded not just to the crisis but to the company's unprecedented speed in addressing it. 3 executives were quietly reassigned, including the VP of Crew Operations. New leadership was installed in the Diversity and Ethics Department, this time led by someone who had actually experienced discrimination, not just studied it. On flights across the country, passengers began to notice small shifts: more diverse crews, new uniforms with pronoun badges, redesigned gate signage that emphasized inclusion in design as well as in message. And while none of these solved the deeper issues alone, they formed a mosaic of effort, a visual confirmation that the company was doing more than waiting for the news cycle to move on. At a layover in Denver, a black passenger named Carla noticed something different when she asked to change her seat. Instead of being dismissed or delayed, the agent smiled and said, "Let me see what I can do." No eye roll, no assumption, just respect. It was a small thing, but she texted her sister anyway. SkyFast's changed. For real. Meanwhile, at Gate C12, the original flashpoint, the area had been unofficially renamed by some employees as Elliot's Gate. No sign marked it, but everyone knew. Every shift, a different employee would walk by and straighten the seating area, check the monitor twice, or simply stand for a moment before moving on. It wasn't ritual. It was remembrance. And yet for Elliot, the most telling moment came quietly on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident. He received a message forwarded by his assistant, originally sent by a low-level employee named Isaac from a SkyFast call center in Albuquerque. The message was short. "Mr. Grant, I watched what happened. I work here. I've seen it. I've stayed quiet for years. But after what you did, I spoke up during our staff meeting. First time I've ever said anything. Thank you." Elliot read it 3 times. Then he folded the paper and placed it not in the company archive but in his personal journal. He didn't reply to Isaac directly. He didn't need to. The change had already begun. That afternoon, as he walked out of the office into the bright Chicago light, Elliot paused at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the traffic flow past in practiced rhythm. People rushed by with coffee, with laptops, with earbuds tucked deep into their ears. Life was moving forward as it always did, but something had shifted quietly, firmly, irreversibly. He adjusted his coat, straightened the cuff of his shirt, and took a breath not of relief but of quiet purpose. Because in the end, this was never about revenge or power or retribution. It was about something quieter, something harder to measure but easier to feel, dignity. And now, finally, it had a seat. 2 months later, Elliot boarded a flight that looked at first glance exactly like the one he had stepped onto that day in Dallas. The terminal was familiar, gate C-12 again, same direction, same morning light coming in through the long windows, same quiet shuffle of passengers lining up for pre-boarding like it was any other Tuesday. But something was different in the air, and Elliot could feel it, not in the temperature or the scent of coffee drifting from the nearby cafe, but in the eyes of the staff, in the way they looked at people now, and maybe even in the way they looked at themselves. There was a softness in the greetings, a kind of attentiveness that wasn't polished or robotic. It was real, like a note played slightly slower because the musician finally understood the lyrics. He walked calmly toward the gate, his briefcase in one hand, his boarding pass in the other, and handed both to the agent, who looked up, saw the name, and smiled not with recognition but with warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Grant." "Welcome back," she said, and the way she said it made it feel like she meant it not because she was told to, but because something had shifted inside the culture she worked in. Elliot nodded gently and stepped into the jet bridge, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly against the metal walls as he approached the plane that had, without meaning, to become part of something much bigger than its flight plan. Inside the cabin, the lights were brighter than he remembered, or perhaps he was just more awake. He passed through the aisle until he reached 1B again, the same seat, the same number, but somehow no longer the same space. The air didn't feel heavy this time. There was no suspicion, no questions, only a young black flight attendant, probably no older than 27, who met his eyes with an expression both respectful and sincere. "Mr. Grant," he said, offering to take his coat. "It's an honor to have you on board with us today. If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, just let me know." Elliot smiled softly and replied, "You're already doing everything right." He sat down slowly, placing his briefcase beneath the seat and settling into the chair, with a sense of stillness that wasn't about exhaustion, but about belonging. The leather felt no different, the texture of the seat was the same, but the weight on his shoulders had changed. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't carrying the burden of representation like armor. He was simply flying. As other passengers boarded, he glanced around the cabin, noticing small things he hadn't seen before. A Latina mother in 1A, soothing her infant with a bottle tucked beneath a soft blanket. A middle-aged Asian man reading a legal brief in seat 2B, his brow furrowed but relaxed. A young woman in jeans and a hijab adjusting her seatbelt with calm confidence. They were all there, diverse, quiet, focused, human, and no one questioned their presence. No one asked for ID. No one tilted their head like something didn't add up. The new safety video began to play on the cabin monitors, and even it had changed, not just in visuals but in tone. It featured a wide range of employees, different ethnicities, different body types, different accents, and the script wasn't just about safety anymore. It was about care, about respect, about recognizing that flying is more than getting from one place to another. It's about how people are treated along the way. Elliot watched in silence, arms folded loosely, feeling the message settle into the space around him like something earned, not advertised. At cruising altitude, he opened his laptop and reviewed a few notes from his team. The first quarterly audit of Skyfast's new protocols had been submitted. Discrimination complaints had dropped by over 40%, customer satisfaction had climbed steadily, and internal employee surveys showed the highest morale numbers in 3 years. The system hadn't been perfected, but it had begun to listen. A flight attendant offered him a drink, and he declined with a small smile. "Just water today, thank you." She nodded, and as she turned away, he let his gaze drift back to the window where sunlight streaked across the wing in long golden arcs. Below them, clouds moved like silent cities, layered and slow, unaware of the stories happening above them. He thought about how long it had taken to get here, not just the months since the incident, but the years before that. The years when being right still meant being doubted, when being qualified still meant being questioned, when being dignified still meant being dismissed. He had never wanted to be the face of change. But sometimes the seat you're asked to leave becomes the place where change begins. He leaned his head back against the seat and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't a sigh. It was release. And at 34,000 feet, suspended between where he'd been and where he was going, Elliot Grant finally felt at peace. The auditorium at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis was full to the edges, but not noisy, not restless, just quietly alive like a room holding its breath. Rows of chairs lined in perfect symmetry, stretched from front to back, filled with government officials, airline executives, civil rights attorneys, and young advocates wearing tags, too big for their coats, but hope too large for their silence. The lights were dimmed, not dramatically but respectfully, letting the warm spot at the podium draw the room's attention to the man who had just stepped up, not with a raised chin or booming voice, but with calm gravity in each step he took. Elliot Grant didn't speak right away. He placed his notes flat on the wooden podium, fingers smoothing them, not because they needed arranging, but because sometimes the hands need a task when the heart is full. Then he looked up, swept the room with his eyes, not to command it but to acknowledge it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was even resonant and unhurried, the kind of voice you don't need to strain to hear because it's not trying to convince you, it's just telling the truth. Change doesn't require noise, he began. It doesn't require lawsuits or riots or camera crews. It requires something quieter, documentation, leverage, and above all, follow-through. A few nods spread across the audience like ripples on still water, not from those who agreed in theory, but from those who had lived it in practice. Since the Skyfast incident, he continued, we've seen a 71% drop in reported airline discrimination cases. Not because people suddenly got kinder, but because systems got better. He clicked to his first slide, a graph clean and undeniable. The bars started high, then dropped sharply, holding low across each quarter. What changed, he asked, gesturing toward the numbers. Policy, oversight, and the courage of witnesses who stopped being silent. Near the front row sat Sarah Mitchell, the flight attendant from that day, her hands clasped in her lap, her posture upright but not tense. When Elliot mentioned witness courage, she lowered her gaze, not in shame but in acknowledgement. After her dismissal, she had undergone extensive bias training, not to rebuild her image, but to understand what she hadn't seen, what she had refused to see. When the floor opened for questions, Sarah raised her hand quietly. Mr. Grant, she said, her voice steadier than anyone expected, I want to publicly thank you. You didn't just change an airline, you changed me. The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be asked for. I didn't understand then, she continued, but I do now. I've spent the last 2 years helping other companies fix what I was once blind to, and I just want you to know I'm still learning, and I'm sorry. Elliot nodded, his expression soft but unwavering. That's what change really looks like, he said, when those who caused harm become part of preventing it. He moved to his final slide, a photo of Angela Thompson, a young woman who had reached out after the Skyfast incident, describing nearly identical treatment, but without the same platform to push back. Angela used the tools we built, Elliot explained. She documented. She filed. She won. Her case against United Airlines resulted in a landmark settlement funding bias, training for over 47,000 airline employees across 3 companies. And now she stood at the edge of the stage, waiting quietly, as Elliot extended his hand and invited her forward. Angela took the stage, eyes glinting with something equal parts, gratitude and resolve. The applause that followed wasn't explosive, it was rising, collective, steady, a recognition not of celebrity but of courage, passed from one person to the next. She didn't need to speak, she just stood there beside him, a quiet answer to the question. Does it matter when we speak up? Elliot turned back to the audience one last time. We all have stories, he said. But stories don't create change, systems do. And when those stories fuel the systems, when documentation becomes design, when voices become votes and votes become standards, then we build a world where dignity travels with us seat by seat. And as he stepped back from the microphone, the room stood as one, not for applause but as if answering a call to rise. Sometimes the most powerful form of resistance isn't shouting, it's staying seated when the world tells you to move. Elliot Grant didn't raise his voice or cause a scene. He simply stood firm in the truth. And from that quiet strength, a ripple became a wave, a story became a system change, and a single act of dignity rewrote how thousands are treated. For those of us who've lived long enough to know injustice doesn't always wear a uniform, this story reminds us it's never too late to speak up, to document what's wrong, and to demand better not just for ourselves, but for those who come after. Whether you've been overlooked, dismissed, or doubted, your presence, your patience, and your persistence matter. You don't need a title or a spotlight to create change. You just need the courage to say, "This is not okay," and the wisdom to do it with grace. Let this be a reminder to all of us. Dignity is not something we ask for, it's something we carry. And when we carry it together, the world takes notice. If this message moved, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice helps the story reach further.